Rome. March 11th, 222 AD. The city, accustomed to the smell of blood and triumph, is now choking on the stench of humiliation. Through the filthy streets, amidst a roaring mob, 2 headless bodies are dragged. One belongs to Julia Soaemias, the emperor's mother. The other to her son. Just yesterday, he held the titles of Augustus, Father of the Fatherland, and, most importantly to him, High Priest of the unconquerable Sun God. His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but history will remember him by the name of his god, Elagabalus. His murderers, soldiers of the Praetorian Guard, the very men sworn to protect him with their lives, now desecrate his corpse with primal fury. They try to shove his body into an opening of the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, as if to symbolically return the filth to where they believed it came from. But the 18-year-old's body is too large for the narrow passage. This final act of rejection, when even the city's sewage refuses to accept the fallen god, becomes a grim metaphor for his entire reign. How? Why did an emperor who literally believed himself a deity, the ruler of the world's greatest empire, end up in a gutter, cursed by his own people and torn apart by his own army? What drove Roman soldiers, men who had seen every imaginable vice and cruelty, to destroy not just the man, but the very memory of him, with such visceral hatred? To answer this, it is not enough to simply list his scandalous acts, including the marriage to a man that headlines our story. We must dive into the very soul of 3rd century Rome and understand what sacred wound this Syrian boy priest inflicted. A wound so deep that the only cure was ritualistic extermination. The story of Elagabalus is not just a biography. It is an autopsy, an anatomical theater, with the very idea of power, religion, and identity laid bare on the dissecting table. To understand the tragedy of Elagabalus, one must first understand the tragedy of the world he inherited. The Roman Empire by 218 AD, the year of his ascension, was no longer the monolith it had been under Trajan or Augustus. It had become a gigantic, tired beast, whose muscles, the legions on the frontiers, were still strong, but whose heart, Rome and Italy itself, suffered from arrhythmia. The Severan dynasty, founded by Septimius Severus, was built on a simple and brutal principle bequeathed to his sons: stay united, pay the soldiers, and despise everyone else. This principle turned the empire into a military dictatorship, where the Senate became a decorative old men's club, and the will of the legions became law. The assassination of Severus's cruel son, Caracalla, in 217, broke the dynastic line and plunged the empire into chaos. The Praetorian prefect Macrinus, a man of non-noble birth and the first emperor who wasn't even a senator, seized the throne. This was a tectonic shift, a violation of all written and unwritten laws. Macrinus was a competent administrator, but he lacked the one thing that mattered: sacred legitimacy, a drop of divine blood in his veins. The soldiers, accustomed to lavish handouts from the Severans, began to grumble. At the same time, the empire was enduring a profound spiritual crisis. The old gods, Jupiter, Mars, Juno, seemed cold and distant. From the east, from Syria, Egypt, and Persia, new cults arrived, offering personal salvation, ecstatic rituals, and a more intimate relationship with the divine. Mithraism, the cult of Isis, Christianity, and, of course, various forms of sun worship were gaining incredible popularity, especially in the army. Rome was like a dry sponge, ready to absorb any new faith, any powerful idea. In this atmosphere of universal fatigue, political instability, and spiritual hunger, a boy was growing up in the distant province of Syria. He was not just a carrier of Severan blood, but also the high priest of one of the most powerful Eastern gods. Fate was preparing the perfect storm, where his family's political ambitions would collide with his personal religious fanaticism, all set against the backdrop of an empire simultaneously desperate for and terrified of change. At the very heart of this brewing storm was the Syrian city of Emesa, modern-day Homs, a city that was less a part of the Roman Empire and more its vassal cultural and religious center. Here, a dynasty of priest-kings had ruled for centuries, serving the local deity, Elagabal, or Elagabalus. This was not an anthropomorphic god in the Greco-Roman style, but a black conical stone, a meteorite, believed to be the direct physical embodiment of the divine power of the sun. The future emperor's family was the most influential in the region. His grandfather, Gaius Julius Bassianus, was the high priest of this cult, and his daughters married Roman aristocrats. The elder, Julia Domna, became the wife of Emperor Septimius Severus. The younger, Julia Maesa, was married to a Syrian aristocrat, Julius Avitus. Maesa, in turn, had two daughters, Julia Soamius and Julia Mamaia. It was Soamius's son, Varius Avitus Bassianus, born in 204, who is our protagonist. This made him the grandnephew of the founder of the Severan dynasty himself. This blood connection, even through the female line, was his greatest asset. But his upbringing and identity were entirely, completely Eastern. From early childhood, he was not trained in Latin and Greek philosophy, with the rigor of a Roman education. His world was the world of the Temple of Elagabal, a place filled with the aroma of incense, the sounds of exotic music, the sight of bright silk robes, and ecstatic dances. He was not just a boy from a noble family. He was a hereditary high priest, groomed from infancy to serve his god. Ancient authors, like Herodian, describe him as an incredibly beautiful youth, his appearance further enhanced by lavish priestly vestments. For him, power was inseparable from ritual and politics from theology. In his mind, there was no division between the secular and the sacred, a division that Rome, however hypocritically, tried to maintain. And in the shadows behind him always stood the women of his family, his powerful, cunning, and incredibly wealthy grandmother, Julia Maesa, and his mother, Julia Soamias, known for her promiscuity, but boundlessly devoted to her son and his divine destiny. It was these women, exiled from Rome by the usurper Macrinus and returned to their native Emesa, who would see in the beautiful boy priest the perfect instrument to return their family to the pinnacle of the world. The fate of Elagabalus was inextricably linked to the black stone he served. This meteorite, venerated in Emesa for centuries, was the center of a powerful and syncretic cult. Elagabal, whose name can be translated as God of the Mountain, was considered not just one of the gods, but the creator of all things, the all-powerful sun deity to whom all other cults must submit. For the young Varius Avitus, this stone was not a symbol, it was a living god. The legends surrounding his birth and childhood only reinforced this sense of predestination. It was said that during rituals, the boy would fall into a trance, dancing around the stone, and that the god himself spoke through him. Unlike Roman emperors who became gods, divas, only after death by decree of the Senate, Elagabalus felt from childhood that he was a direct incarnation, an avatar of his deity on earth. This fundamental difference in worldview would become one of the main stumbling blocks in his relationship with Rome. Roman religion was, at its core, polytheistic and tolerant. New gods could be incorporated into the pantheon, but on one condition. They had to recognize the supremacy of the Roman state cult, primarily the trinity of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. This was a religious contract, the foundation of Roman identity. Elagabalus, however, brought with him an idea completely alien and hostile to this order, the idea of religious absolutism. His God was not one of many, he was the only true God. All others were merely his pale shadows or servants. This was a prophecy of a new era, which the boy priest carried in his heart. He did not intend to add his God to the Roman pantheon. He intended to rebuild the entire pantheon around his God, placing the black stone from Emesa in the spot that Jupiter Optimus Maximus had occupied for centuries. For him, this was not a political blunder. It was the fulfillment of a sacred mission. He was traveling to Rome not as an administrator, but as a Messiah, and this fanatical conviction in his own righteousness made him completely deaf to warnings, traditions, and political reality. The future emperor's character was forged in a unique environment where Eastern theocracy met Roman political heritage. His childhood was spent in luxury and adoration. He was never denied anything, surrounded by servants, eunuchs, and priests who saw him as a living deity. Unlike a young Marcus Aurelius, studying Stoic philosophy and the principles of self-restraint, or a Trajan, who endured the harsh school of army discipline, Elagabalus was raised in an atmosphere of theatrical mysticism. Daily rituals, lavish processions, sacred dances, in which, according to witnesses, he took the most active part. All this shaped his personality. He was an artist on the stage of his own cult. Herodian and Cassius Dio, the main, though extremely hostile sources on his reign, pay enormous attention to his appearance. He lined his eyes, rouged his cheeks, and wore opulent, gold-embroidered robes, diadems, and jewelry. In the Roman world, where the ideal of masculinity was restraint, gravitas, military valor, and manliness, this image was provocative and shocking. But in the context of his native culture, where priests of fertility gods and celestial bodies often practiced ritual cross-dressing and adopted an androgynous appearance to better serve their deities, his behavior was normal. This cultural gap was unbridgeable. What was, to him, a sacred duty and an expression of piety was, to the Romans, a sign of effeminacy, debauchery, and madness. He was not ready for compromise because he saw no need for it. Why should a god adapt to mortals? It was mortals who had to accept his divine will. This absolute certainty in his own righteousness, nurtured in the temple forge of Emesa, would become his Achilles' heel. He did not understand or respect Roman institutions, the Senate, the army, the law, because in his world, all of B that was secondary to the will of the god he channeled as high priest. The turning point came in 218. Julia Maesa, Elagabalus's powerful grandmother, exiled to Emesa by Macrinus, had no intention of accepting her loss of power. She possessed a colossal fortune and flawless political instincts. Watching the growing dissatisfaction with Macrinus among the legions, she devised a daring plan. She spread a rumor that her 14-year-old grandson was actually the illegitimate son of the beloved Emperor Caracalla, who had once visited Emesa. This rumor was pure fabrication, but it fell on fertile ground. To the soldiers, the blood of the Severans was sacred. Maesa backed up the legend with gold. That night, she secretly brought her grandson, dressed in purple, to the camp of the 3rd Gallic Legion, stationed nearby. The soldiers were shown the handsome youth, who looked just like the images of Caracalla, and were promised enormous sums of money. The legion immediately swore allegiance to him. Thus began the rebellion. Macrinus, who was in Antioch, initially underestimated the threat, dismissing it as a minor revolt. But other legions, lured by the Severan name and Maesa's gold, began to flock to Elagabalus. On June 8, 218, the decisive battle took place outside Antioch. Macrinus's army was larger and more experienced, but at the battle's critical moment, the usurper himself showed cowardice and fled the field, leading to a complete rout of his troops. Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Soemias, according to historians, personally rode along the lines of their soldiers, inspiring them to fight. This was his first and only military experience. Victory was achieved. Macrinus and his son were soon caught and executed. The 14-year-old Syrian priest, who had never seen Rome, was proclaimed emperor. For him, this was not just a political victory, it was an omen. His God had granted him power over the world, and he intended to repay his God by turning the entire world into his temple. The Senate in Rome, receiving news of the fait accompli, was forced to confirm the new ruler, hoping the powerful women of his family could keep the youth within the bounds of propriety. They did not yet know that what was bearing down on Rome was not a politician, but a religious fanatic. Behind every great or terrible deed in history lies a driving force, a hidden spring that pushes the protagonist forward. In the case of Elagabalus, this force was not a thirst for power in its traditional Roman sense. He did not aspire to military conquests like Trajan or administrative reforms like Hadrian. His secret and yet entirely obvious motivation was religious syncretism in its most radical form. He genuinely believed his mission was to unite all the religions of the empire under the auspices of one God. His God, Elagabal. In his mind, Jupiter, the Syrian Baal, the Egyptian Ra, even the Jewish Yahweh, these were all just different names, different manifestations of a single indivisible solar power whose physical embodiment was the black stone from a mesa. This idea, in itself, was not entirely new to Rome. The era was inclined towards syncretism. However, Elagabalus approached its implementation with the fanaticism of a neophyte and the absolutism of a despot. He did not offer dialogue, he demanded submission. His inner demon was the demon of unification, a desire to erase all cultural and religious differences and melt them down in the crucible of his cult. This was a utopian, messianic idea that had nothing in common with Roman pragmatism. He wanted to give Rome a new soul, not understanding that Rome would sooner die than allow its old one to be torn out. All his subsequent actions, which the Romans perceived as a series of mad and sacrilegious acts, from transporting the sacred stone to Rome, to his marriage to a Vestal virgin, to his own gender performances, were, for him, logical and consistent steps toward this great goal. He was building a new world, and in this world, he was not just an emperor, but a high priest, a prophet, and a living God. This obsession with one idea, this complete fusion of personal faith and state policy, became the fuel that consumed both him and his short, brilliant, supernova-like reign. The new emperor's journey from Syria to Rome took over a year, and it was not so much a journey as a protracted religious procession which became the empire's first shock. Instead of hurrying to the capital to consolidate his power and secure the Senate's support, Elagabalus moved slowly, spending the winter of 218 to 219 in Nicomedia. He brought with him his main attribute of power, the Black Stone. By his order, a full-length portrait of him was painted and sent to Rome. It depicted him not as a Roman general or magistrate, but in his role as high priest of Elagabal, in silk robes, with lined eyes and rouged cheeks, making a sacrifice to his god. This portrait was ordered to be hung in the Senate House, directly above the altar of victory, so that the senators, when making their traditional libations, would in fact be praying to the new god and his priest. This was an unprecedented act, a direct insult and challenge to the entire Roman establishment. The news reaching Rome was increasingly alarming. There were stories of strange rituals, of barbaric music, of the influence his Syrian attendants had on the young emperor. Even then, long before his arrival in the capital, his image as the outsider, the Eastern despot who threatened age-old traditions, began to form. Every stop on his procession turned into a religious festival, where he demonstrated his piety by dancing around the sacred stone and sacrificing hecatombs of bulls. He made no attempt to appear Roman. On the contrary, he emphasized his otherness, his connection to the mystical and powerful East. Whether this was a deliberate policy or youthful naivety is hard to say. Most likely, it was both. He believed his divine mission was, in itself, sufficient grounds for power, and he felt no need to mask or pretend. This slow, provocative journey was the prelude, the overture to the religious drama he intended to stage on the world's main stage, in Rome itself. When Elagabalus finally arrived in Rome in the autumn of 219, the city greeted him with a mixture of curiosity, hope, and poorly concealed fear. The people, exhausted by civil wars and Caracalla's tyranny, longed for peace and stability. The Senate hoped the emperor's young age would allow them to manipulate him through his more sensible grandmother, Julia Maesa. However, all these hopes began to crumble from the very first days. Elagabalus wasted no time on political games or currying favor with the aristocracy. His first and primary concern was the establishment of his god's cult. On the Palatine Hill, in the very heart of Rome overlooking the Forum, construction began on a magnificent temple, the Elagabalium, where the black stone was solemnly placed. This temple was to become the new sacred center, not only of the city, but of the entire empire. Elagabalus unequivocally declared that all gods, Roman and foreign alike, were henceforth merely servants of his great sun god. The most sacred relics of Rome, such as the eternal flame of Vesta, the Palladium, the statue of Athena supposedly brought from Troy, and the shields of the Salii, were forcibly moved to the new temple to symbolically subordinate them to the black stone. This was unheard of sacrilege. For the Romans, this was equivalent to someone storming a sacred cathedral, placing an idol on the main altar, and demanding the clergy worship it. Senators and equestrians, the elite of Roman society, were forced to attend daily rituals that seemed to them wild and barbaric. Instead of the austere and restrained Roman ceremonies, they saw the emperor, dressed in effeminate clothing, dancing to the sounds of flutes and drums, while countless animals were sacrificed around the altar. There were even sinister rumors of human sacrifices, for which beautiful children from noble families were supposedly kidnapped throughout Italy. These rumors were likely exaggerations, but they perfectly reflected the horror that gripped Roman society. The new ruler was not just introducing a new cult, he was destroying the foundations of their world. The strategy of Elagabalus, if it can be called that, was politically suicidal. Instead of following the proven path of Roman emperors, first, consolidate power through the army, then secure the loyalty of the Senate through demonstrations of respect, and only then, carefully, introduce reforms. He began with the most sensitive, most explosive aspect of Roman life: religion. His main strategic miscalculation was a complete misunderstanding of what religion was to the Romans. It was not a system of personal belief, but the foundation of the state itself, the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, a contract that ensured Rome's prosperity and invincibility. To break this contract was to endanger the very existence of the empire. By declaring his Syrian god, Elagabal, the supreme deity, to whom Jupiter Capitolinus himself must submit, He didn't just offend religious sensibilities. He committed an act of treason on a metaphysical scale. He instantly turned the entire Roman establishment, from senators to priests, into his enemies. His tactical masterpiece, if viewed through his own mad logic, was the consistency and energy with which he set to work. He did not hesitate. The construction of the Elagabalium, the transfer of sacred relics, the forcing of the elite to participate in alien rituals, all this was done in the first months of his reign. He acted like a surgeon who decided to amputate a patient's heart to replace it with a new one, without bothering with anesthesia or the patient's consent. This radical religious reform was his main and essentially only political program. He genuinely believed that by establishing the correct cult, he would solve all the empire's problems. But instead of harmony and prosperity, he sowed the wind, and he was about to reap the whirlwind. In this suicidal campaign against Roman traditions, Elagabalus relied on a circle of people who, in the eyes of Roman society, were just as much outsiders and marginal figures as he was. His closest advisors, friends, and appointees to high state posts were not experienced senators or distinguished generals, but characters seemingly straight out of a satirical comedy. According to Cassius Dio and the author of the Augustan history, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the commander of the emperor's personal guard, was, for a time, a certain Comazon, a former actor and dancer. The prefect of Rome, responsible for order in the capital, was a man who had previously been just a charioteer in the circus. Command of the urban cohorts, essentially the police, was entrusted to his personal barber. High positions in the provinces and the army were sold to the highest bidder or given to his lovers. The most influential figure at court, aside from the emperor's mother and grandmother, was his favorite, a slave from Caria named Heracles. Elagabalus was so infatuated with this blonde charioteer that he called him his husband and demanded that others address him as the Empress and the wife of Heracles. This inner circle was not just incompetent, it was a symbolic insult to the entire Roman value system, which was based on hierarchy, merit, however nominal, and lineage. Rome could tolerate cruelty, it could forgive eccentricity, but it could not forgive humiliation. Appointing an actor, who by law was considered infamous or dishonorable, to one of the highest military posts was a spit in the face to every legionary and every aristocrat. At the same time, his enemies became everyone who embodied traditional Rome. He openly despised the Senate, ignoring its meetings or turning them into a farce. He irritated the Praetorian Guard, the very basis of his power, with his effeminate behavior and disregard for military valor. The common people of Rome, initially intrigued by the exotic spectacles, soon tired of the constant religious ceremonies and began to grumble about rising prices and incompetent governance. Thus, in less than 3 years, Elagabalus managed to turn every single stratum of Roman society against him. Throughout his short reign, Elagabalus repeatedly found himself at a crossroads where he could have taken a step toward reconciliation with Roman society. But every time, he chose the path of escalation. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, an experienced and cynical politician, saw clearly how her grandson was rapidly losing support. She begged him to be more restrained, to wear Roman clothing, to at least pretend to honor the traditional gods, and to pay attention to state affairs. But for Elagabalus, this was unthinkable. To compromise meant betraying his god and his mission. One of these crucial junctures was related to his marriages. A Roman emperor was expected to be married and have an heir. Elagabalus married 5 times in 3 years, but each marriage was either a political disaster or a personal scandal. His first wife was Julia Cornelia Paula, a girl from a noble Roman family, This marriage was Mysa's attempt to reconcile her grandson with the aristocracy. But within a year, he divorced her, claiming he had found some bodily defect, which was a public humiliation for her entire family. His next choice plunged Rome into a state of shock. He married Julia Aquilia Severa, who was a Vestal virgin, a priestess of the goddess Vesta, who had taken a 30-year vow of chastity. Breaking this vow was punishable by a horrific death. The Vestal was buried alive in a tomb. The emperor, however, not only took her as his wife, but publicly declared that this marriage was a sacred union between a god, himself, and a priestess, from which god-like children would be born. For the Romans, this was the height of sacrilege, an act that could bring the wrath of all the gods down upon the city. Even after this marriage, which caused a storm of indignation, he had a chance to reconsider. But he divorced her, married twice more, and then returned to Aquilia Severa. This series of marriages and divorces, compounded by his open homosexual relationships, demonstrated a complete contempt for the Roman concept of marriage as a sacred union and the foundation of the state. Each of his choices was not a mistake, but a deliberate step, leading him further from Rome and closer to the abyss. The zenith of Elagabalus's power, and simultaneously his moment of absolute hubris, was a grandiose ritual he orchestrated in the summer of 220. It was the sacred marriage of his god. He decided that Elagabal, like any god, needed a wife. At first, his choice fell on Pallas, the sacred statue of Athena, kept in the temple of Vesta and considered a pledge of Rome's invincibility. He ordered the statue to be moved to his Elagabalium and performed a wedding ceremony. This caused such horror and indignation that even he seemed to realize he had gone too far. He declared that the warlike and virginal goddess was not a suitable spouse for his amorous sun god. Then he found what he considered the perfect bride. From Carthage, Rome's ancient enemy, the sacred statue of the celestial goddess Tanit, or Urania, was brought over. A massive festival was held. The entire capital was involved in the event. A magnificent procession moved through the streets, with the emperor himself dancing backwards in front of the chariot, carrying the goddess's statue, so as not to lose sight of his new mother-in-law. Food, wine, and money were distributed throughout the city. This marriage of a Syrian god to an African goddess, staged in the capital of the world, was, for Elagabalus, the culmination of his religious program. He had symbolically united the great cults of the East and Africa under his rule, demonstrating the secondary, insignificant nature of traditional Roman gods. From his perspective, this was an act of supreme theology, the creation of a new universal pantheon. From the perspective of the Romans, it was a grotesque farce and a national humiliation. The emperor was not just neglecting their gods, he was openly mocking them, arranging a wedding between some barbarian idols and forcing the entire city to celebrate it. It was at this moment, the moment of his greatest triumph, as he saw it, that Rome's patience began to run out. The seeds of anger he had sown began to sprout. The first storm clouds gathered where power in Rome was always tested for its strength, in the barracks of the Praetorian Guard. The soldiers who had brought him to power expected to see in him the son of Caracalla, a generous, warlike, and manly leader. Instead, they got a priest who spent most of his time in a temple, not in a military camp. Everything about him irritated them: his luxurious silk robes, his makeup, his ecstatic dances. It was a complete mismatch with the image of an emperor that had been cultivated in the army for centuries. Moreover, his appointments filled them with contempt. When dancers and charioteers are given the highest posts, it devalues military merit and breaks the entire system of army hierarchy. The grumbling in the barracks grew louder. The soldiers, who were receiving generous pay, were at first willing to tolerate the new ruler's quirks, but their professional pride was wounded. They had sworn an oath to the eagle, the symbol of Roman power and Jupiter, and they were being forced to worship some black stone from Syria. This cultural and aesthetic conflict was just as important as the political one. The Praetorians were not just mercenaries. They saw themselves as defenders of Roman values, guardians of true Roman identity. And they watched as that identity was being destroyed before their very eyes by the man they themselves had put on the throne. Their discontent was skillfully fueled by Julia Maesa. She regularly visited the Praetorian camp, handed out money, and reminded the soldiers of her loyalty to the traditions and the Severan dynasty. She was beginning to prepare the ground for a change in power. The cracks in the foundation of Elagabalus's regime were becoming visible, and the first serious storm threatened to bring the whole building down. If the religious reform was a powder keg, the marriage to the Vestal Virgin Aquilia Severa was the spark that lit the fuse. This act wasn't just another scandal. It was an act that crossed every conceivable line. The institution of the Vestals was one of the pillars of Roman religion and statehood. 6 girls from the noblest families were chosen to serve the goddess Vesta, guardian of the hearth and the sacred flame of Rome, which, according to legend, had burned since the city's founding. They took a 30-year vow of chastity. Their purity was a guarantee of the state's well-being. The violation of this vow, incestum, was considered one of the most terrible crimes and required atonement through ritual execution. And now, the emperor, who by his office as Pontifex Maximus was the chief guardian of all religious laws, violated them himself in the most flagrant way. He didn't just seduce a Vestal, he publicly married her, taking her from the Temple of Vesta. He explained his action with the disarming logic of a fanatic. It is fitting that a priest should marry a priestess. He saw in it a supreme sacred meaning, a fusion of 2 great cults. For Rome, this was definitive proof of his madness and impiety. This marriage became the turning point. If before he was seen as an eccentric, spoiled youth, now he was seen as a real threat to Rome's very existence. People believed that such an act would inevitably bring the wrath of the gods down on the city. Plagues, famine, military defeats, indignation swept through all levels of society. The senators were horrified. The common people were openly outraged. Even his own family understood that he had gone too far. The marriage to the Vestal became the fatal act that stripped Elagabalus of his last shred of legitimacy in the eyes of the Romans and set in motion the mechanism of his overthrow. Julia Maesa, the woman who had essentially created Emperor Elagabalus, now watched in horror as her creation spun out of control, threatening to destroy the entire family. She realized that her grandson was a political corpse, and his overthrow was only a matter of time. But she had no intention of letting power slip from her hands. Instead of trying to fix Elagabalus, she decided to replace him. She had a backup plan: her second grandson, the son of her younger daughter Julia Mamaea, the 13-year-old Bassianus Alexander, who would go down in history as Alexander Severus. Alexander was the complete opposite of his cousin. His mother had raised him in strict Roman traditions. He was a modest, restrained, and obedient boy who showed an interest in governance and military affairs. Maesa began her subtle political game. She convinced Elagabalus to adopt Alexander and give him the title of Caesar, or heir. Her argument was simple. You must devote yourself to your divine duties, and your cousin will take care of boring earthly affairs. Elagabalus, perhaps under pressure from his mother and grandmother, agreed. This was the beginning of the end. Mysa and Mamaea began to actively promote Alexander. They introduced him to senators, and most importantly, to the soldiers of the Praetorian Guard. They spared no expense, distributing lavish gifts in the young Caesar's name. The soldiers quickly saw the difference. On one side, an effeminate priest, busy with incomprehensible rituals. On the other, a modest, masculine youth who looked and behaved like a true Roman. The guard's sympathies rapidly shifted to Alexander's side. Elagabalus did not immediately realize what a deadly trap his own grandmother had set for him. But when he saw his cousin's growing popularity, he was seized by a jealousy that soon turned into paranoia. The central element of the scandal that would forever be etched in Roman history was not only Elagabalus's religious reforms, but also his personal life, particularly his relationships with men. The ancient sources, like Cassius Dio and the Augustan history, which must be read with a degree of skepticism due to their clear hostility, paint a picture of unprecedented sexual licentiousness. The main figure in this picture was Heracles, the slave charioteer whom the emperor made his favorite and lover. The relationship between Elagabalus and Heracles went far beyond the common Roman practice of same-sex relations between a master and a slave. Elagabalus publicly called Heracles his husband. During palace ceremonies, he would kiss him as a Roman matron would kiss her spouse. He even allegedly promised him the title of Caesar. But the most shocking thing for the Roman mentality was not the relationship itself, but the distribution of roles. Roman society was rigidly patriarchal, and in same-sex relationships, the key concept was dominance. A free-born Roman citizen could engage in sexual relations with slaves or youths, but only in the active, dominant role. To take the passive role was considered the ultimate humiliation, the lot of slaves and women. Elagabalus, according to the historians, did not just take the passive role, he reveled in it. He demanded that Heracles treat him as his wife, beat him when he was unfaithful, and publicly complained about his husband's infidelity. This performance, played out in front of the entire court, was a subversion of the very foundations of the Roman idea of power. The emperor, the princeps, the first among equals, the embodiment of male valor and authority, was voluntarily placing himself in the subordinate position of a woman. This was not just a personal matter, it was a political statement, a complete inversion of gender and social roles that Roman society could neither understand nor accept. Corruption and incompetence reached unprecedented levels under Elagabalus. The administration of the vast empire was handed over to a cabal consisting of his favorites and lovers. Sources report that state offices, from provincial governorships to command of the legions, were openly sold at auction in the palace. The price depended not on the candidate's competence, but on the size of his fortune, or, as historians sneered, on the size of his genitals. Influence over the emperor, and therefore over state affairs, was held not by senators and jurists, but by dancers, actors, cooks, and barbers. This court of favorites provoked rage and contempt from the old aristocracy, who watched as centuries-old institutions were turned into a farce. For example, it is claimed that a eunuch was in charge of distributing favors and offices, amassing a huge fortune in the process. Another favorite, Aurelius Zoticus, an athlete from Smyrna, was brought to Rome, showered with honors, and appointed to an important post solely for his physical attributes, only to be exiled when he failed to satisfy the emperor. These stories, even if exaggerated, reflect the general atmosphere of decay and arbitrary rule. For a Roman senator or general who had dedicated his entire life to serving the state, it was an unbearable humiliation to take orders from a former slave or an actor. This destroyed the very meritocracy, the system of merit, on which the empire, in theory, was built. Decisions were made not based on state interests, but on the whims and caprices of the emperor and his circle. This led to chaos in governance, rising taxes that went to satisfy the court's insane spending, and a general feeling that the ship of state was rudderless and heading for the rocks. The most scandalous and, perhaps, least reliable accusations against Elagabalus concern his gender experiments and alleged prostitution. Hostile historians like Cassius Dio write that the emperor not only behaved like a woman, but tried to become one. He supposedly removed his body hair, wore women's clothing and wigs, and even offered vast sums of money to any physician who could surgically create female genitalia for him. These claims should be treated with caution, as they are typical elements of ancient political invective aimed at the complete dehumanization of an enemy. Nevertheless, rumors of such behavior undoubtedly circulated in Rome and contributed to his demonization. It is also reported that he set up a brothel in the palace, where he himself acted as a prostitute. He allegedly stood naked in the doorway of his room, soliciting passers-by, imitating the manners and voice of a brothel worker. He supposedly argued with actual prostitutes over who could service more clients or earn more money. Regardless of whether these stories were true or malicious slander, they shaped public opinion. For the Romans, with their cult of masculine strength and dignity, the thought that their emperor, their pater patriae, father of the fatherland, not only adopted a passive sexual role, but also mimicked the most despised female profession, was an absolute nightmare. This was the rock bottom of degradation, the complete erasure of the boundary between a ruler and his opposite. These rumors, passed from mouth to mouth, turned the emperor into a monster, an impious creature who defiled the very air of Rome. They prepared the psychological ground for his murder, presenting it not as a political act, but as an act of sanitary cleansing for the city. Another step perceived as a mockery of Roman traditions was the creation of the so-called Little Senate, Cenaculum. This was an assembly composed exclusively of women, which met on the Quirinal Hill under the presidency of the emperor's mother, Julia Soaemias. This women's senate did not deal with matters of high politics, war, or finance. Its competence, according to historians, was limited to issuing decrees on women's fashion, rules of etiquette, and matters of precedence among matrons. For example, they would decide which outfits were appropriate to wear, who was entitled to ride in a chariot versus a litter, and which jewelry corresponded to which social status. From a modern perspective, this might seem like a harmless or even progressive idea, but in the context of 3rd century Rome, it was unheard of. The Roman world was a man's world. Women, even from the imperial family, could wield enormous informal influence, as Julia Maesa herself proved. But formal, public power belonged exclusively to men. The creation of an official women's senate, even with trivial powers, was seen as a parody of the real Senate, as yet another humiliation of that venerable institution. It undermined the gender hierarchy that was as crucial to the Roman world order as the social one. Elagabalus's enemies used this fact as further proof that he was under his mother's thumb, and that the empire was being ruled not by men, but by debauched Syrian women. This added fuel to the fire of xenophobia and misogyny already raging in Rome. Realizing the threat posed by Alexander's growing popularity, Elagabalus moved from passive jealousy to active measures. His paranoia reached its peak. He saw his young cousin, whom he himself had adopted, as his chief rival. He tried to revoke his decision, to strip Alexander of his title of Caesar and all associated honors. He forbade him from appearing in public and ordered the arrest of his tutors and friends, accusing them of turning the boy against him and using witchcraft to make him sick. But these actions had the opposite effect. The Senate, which already saw Alexander as its savior, refused to ratify the decree stripping him of his title. More importantly, the Praetorians rebelled. They openly declared that they would not allow any harm to come to their favorite. They demanded that Elagabalus stop the persecution and ensure the Caesar's safety. This was open mutiny. The emperor, who ruled with absolute power, was now facing his own guard dictating terms to him. Terrified, he was forced to concede. He went with Alexander to the Praetorian camp to demonstrate their reconciliation. But this episode was his final warning. He understood that the soldiers were no longer on his side. His power, based solely on the force of arms, was slipping from his grasp. Instead of learning from this and trying to change his behavior, Elagabalus harbored a grudge and began to plot a revenge that would lead directly to his death. In a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation, Elagabalus made his last and fatal mistake. He decided to test the Praetorians' loyalty by spreading a false rumor that Alexander was on his deathbed. He wanted to see their reaction, identify his enemies, and punish them. The reaction surpassed his worst fears. As soon as the news reached the camp, the soldiers became furious. They didn't believe the rumor. They suspected the emperor had murdered his cousin. The guardsmen refused their duties and barricaded themselves in the camp, declaring they would not come out until they were shown Alexander, alive and well. The entire city tensed. This was no longer just grumbling. This was an open rebellion in the heart of the capital. Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Soaemias, were trapped. They could not use force against the entire Praetorian Guard, and they could no longer ignore their demands. Panic seized the imperial palace. It was clear the game was lost. Under pressure of circumstance, and likely at the insistence of Julia Maesa, who saw her plan about to come to fruition, the decision was made to meet the soldiers' demand. It was the last card the emperor could play, but it was a trump card in his enemy's hands. The next day, March 11th, 222, the scene that became the prologue to the bloody climax unfolded. Elagabalus and Alexander, each accompanied by his mother, Julia Soaemias and Julia Mamaia, traveled in the imperial carriage to the Praetorian camp. It was the emperor's last, desperate attempt to quell the mutiny and demonstrate unity in the ruling family. But as soon as they entered the camp, it was obvious whose side the soldiers were on. Alexander was met with ecstatic cheers and applause. The soldiers surrounded his litter, expressing their loyalty and joy that he was alive. Elagabalus, however, was met with icy silence and hostile glares. He was completely ignored. For a man who considered himself a living god and was accustomed to universal adoration, this was an unbearable humiliation. His self-control, always fragile, finally abandoned him. In a fit of rage, he spotted several soldiers, who were most enthusiastically cheering Alexander, and ordered his small contingent of guards to immediately arrest and execute them for insubordination. It was suicide. The moment his guards tried to carry out the order, the Praetorians' patience snapped. They drew their swords. What happened next was not an execution, but a massacre. The Praetorians, enraged by the emperor's order, fell upon his small guard and upon him. Elagabalus, seeing the flash of steel, lost all his divine majesty. He tried to flee and hide, ironically, in a palace latrine. His mother, Julia Soaemias, seeing her son was doomed, threw herself at him and tried to shield him with her body. But the soldiers' rage was boundless. They killed them both, showing not a flicker of mercy. Their closest associates and favorites, including Heracles, were hunted down and also brutally murdered. But simple murder was not enough. The soldiers and the mob that joined them craved not just death, but humiliation. They cut off the heads of Elagabalus and his mother and mounted them on pikes. Their naked bodies were dragged through the streets of Rome to cheers and jeers. It was an act of ritual cleansing, an expulsion of defilement. They dragged the emperor's body through the circus, the site of his supposed debaucheries, and all the way to the Tiber. Along the way, they tried to stuff it into the sewer, but as mentioned, the body wouldn't fit. This grotesque finale, a god who didn't fit in a drainpipe, was the final chord in this tragedy of the absurd. Finally, weighting his corpse, they threw it from a bridge into the river to ensure he would never find a final resting place in the earth. The god who sought union with the sun found his end in the murky, cold waters of the Tiber. Physical death was only the beginning. It was followed by symbolic death, the damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. This was the ultimate punishment the Roman state could inflict on its enemies. By decree of the Senate, which was now happy to carry out the will of the new rulers, Alexander Severus and his mother and grandmother, the name of Elagabalus was erased from all official documents, from inscriptions on arches and buildings. His statues were smashed, coins bearing his image melted down. The very name, Elagabalus, which he had worn with pride, was forbidden. He was given back his original name, Varius Avitus Bassianus, to emphasize that he had never been a true Roman emperor. The cult of the god Elagabal was immediately abolished, and the black stone was sent back to Emesa under the strictest secrecy. All his decrees were nullified. Rome tried to pretend that those 4 years had simply never happened, to excise them from its history like a cancerous tumor. This total war on his memory was so successful that for nearly 2 millennia, Elagabalus remained in history not as a complex and contradictory figure, but as a caricature of a villain, an archetype of the Eastern despot, a symbol of absolute moral decay and sexual deviation. He became a convenient boogeyman, a benchmark against which even Nero and Caligula seemed like more reasonable rulers. Historians who wrote about him, from Cassius Dio to the writers of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, competed in describing his vices, often uncritically repeating and amplifying the propaganda created by his murderers. The legacy of Elagabalus is paradoxical. On one hand, his reign was so short and catastrophic that it left behind no significant political or administrative reforms. He built nothing, apart from his temple, which was immediately demolished. He won no wars and did not expand the empire's borders. His mark on the material history of Rome was almost completely erased. But on the other hand, his image left an indelible scar on the collective memory of Western civilization. For centuries, he was the absolute embodiment of the other, the anti-emperor, the anti-Roman. For Christian authors, he was a precursor to the Antichrist, a perverse pagan. For Enlightenment thinkers like Edward Gibbon, he was the most vivid example of the decline and decay wrought by Eastern despotism. In the 19th century, he became an icon for the Decadence, who admired his aestheticism, his contempt for bourgeois morality, and his gender bending. In the 20th and 21st centuries, his figure has been reinterpreted yet again. Some see him as one of history's first transgender figures, a victim of intolerance and rigid gender norms. Others see him as a failed religious reformer who tried, however clumsily, to create a universal monotheistic religion a century before Constantine converted to Christianity. His story is a mirror in which every generation sees a reflection of its own fears, prejudices, and values. He remains an eternal reminder that history is written by the victors, and that behind the official version of events often lies a more complex and tragic human drama. And so, we return to the main question posed at the beginning. Why was an emperor who married a man and proclaimed himself a god not just killed, but torn to pieces and thrown into a sewer? The answer is multi-layered, but its essence comes down to one concept: identity. Elagabalus was destroyed with such fury not for his individual acts, not for corruption, not for sexual scandals, and not even for cruelty. Rome had seen all that and worse. He was destroyed because he launched a total, comprehensive assault on the very essence of Roman identity. First, he attacked its religious core. By replacing Jupiter with his black stone, he tried to rip the heart from the body of the Roman state. Second, he attacked its social and gender core. By publicly adopting a female role, marrying a slave, and putting women in charge of a senate, he turned the entire patriarchal system on which the Roman world rested upside down. Third, he attacked its cultural and ethnic core. He did not try to become Roman. He, a Syrian, demanded that Rome become an extension of his Eastern despotism. His murder was not just a palace coup. It was an act of immune rejection. The Roman system recognized him as a foreign element, a virus threatening the entire organism, and destroyed him in the most brutal way possible to prevent infection. The rage of the mob and the soldiers was the rage of a people who were having everything that made them who they were: their gods, their traditions, their concepts of masculinity and power, torn away from them. The marriage to a man and the body dumped in the sewer are not cause and effect. They are two symptoms of the same fundamental drama: the collision of two incompatible worlds within the body of one man, who imagined himself a god, but turned out to be merely mortal. The story of Elagabalus, stripped of propaganda and myth, is not just an anecdote about a mad emperor. It is an eternal and universal parable, with lessons that are still relevant today. It is a story about what happens when absolute power is unrestrained by tradition, responsibility, or common sense. It is a story about the collision of civilizations, about what happens when one culture tries to forcibly impose its values on another without any attempt to understand or respect its soul. It is the tragedy of religious fanaticism, which, in its blind faith in its own righteousness, is willing to destroy everything in its path. It is the drama of a personality, perhaps deeply insecure, who tried to find his identity by breaking every existing framework, only to be broken and destroyed by a world that was stronger. The story of Elagabalus asks us timeless questions. Where is the line between reform and destruction? What is more important, loyalty to one's personal truth or duty to society? And what price must be paid for an attempt to change the world? The fall of this young Syrian priest from the pinnacle of power into a Roman sewer is a grim warning to all who believe they can remake human nature in their own image, forgetting that the oldest and deepest roots of culture and tradition are often stronger than any throne, even the most powerful.